Hello there, and welcome back to another week here at Biogeography. This week is actually the last module week that we're going to have. I'm sure that's very that's upsetting for you guys. Yeah, so this we're pretty much at the end of the semester now. There was one other chapter that I'd hoped to get to, but I think I'm going to skip that and let you guys have next week to prep for the final. So this will be the last module. I've enjoyed this semester with you guys. I know it's been a little bit weird, maybe more than a little bit with being remote, and it hasn't been ideal, but I've been really impressed with how engaged the entire class has been throughout the entire semester, and hope hope you guys have enjoyed taking the class as much as I've enjoyed teaching it, and hopefully you got something worthwhile out of it. Um, that being said, getting into the details here of what we're going to be doing for the so next week is there will not be a module next week. This module will be due, but I won't be assigning a new module next week. What I will be doing is posting the study guide for the final. The final will be during finals week. I'll try to schedule it on the day that it's supposed to be scheduled, but we're probably going to be doing it a little bit differently. I'll be making an announcement on Canvas for this, so don't feel like you have to have all this memorized. But basically, it'll be take home, and there'll be a list of short answer essay style questions for you to answer. Usually, how I do it is like I write up 10 or 12 essay questions, and then I let you pick half of them, whichever half you want, and answer those. So I'll be sure to put out a Canvas announcement that has those details in it as I get those finalized, but just keep an eye out next week for that study guide that I will make available. So let's see here. I think that covers pretty much. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that course evaluations will be either are available now or will be available soon. So please take some time to fill those out once they're available. I'm a PhD student. I'm pretty early on in my career, so having those evaluations from you guys is actually super helpful and critical for me to evaluate how I'm doing. So I read them, I take them seriously. So if there's things that you liked about the course, let me know. If there's things that you would have liked to have seen done differently, let me know. And just overall, give me your impressions of the course. That would be very helpful. Okay, so this week, this last module, we are getting into what is conservation biogeography. It's an interesting concept, or sort of a blending of some different things, and so let's sort of get into it here. One thing about conservation biogeography is that, if you want to understand, it's sort of about the relationship between humans and things like the changes that we've imposed on the environment and how we might be able to mitigate some of those destructive things. But if you really want to understand the changes in the relationship, then you have to understand the history of the organisms that you're looking at, as well as the history of our species, humanity, and how that's changed over time. And so it really is kind of a blend of conservation biology, and also aspects of biogeography. So it's sort of the history of humans, the history of other species that you might be interested in, and the interactions between those two things. So if we start out, we're not going to go, we have to look at some historical things of humans. We're not going to go all the way back, and these details change a lot. But the broad strokes are pretty much well known. We know that humans and our direct ancestors came out of Africa. And you can see that line here, and these numbers, I think, indicate sort of the millions of years ago that occurred. And we know, there were other lines like the Neanderthals and Homo erectus, and some of these other things that happen. As we get new evidence, these are sort of things, and I'll probably say this a couple times, that these dates and things tend to change a lot and shift a lot as we find new fossils, and our techniques for analyzing those fossils improve. However, I think, it's the consensus is emerging on these broad strokes that humans evolved out of Africa and then sort of dispersed outward. And there's a lot of evidence for all of this. So here's just an outline of some principal sources of information about how we reconstructed the evolutionary origins and the geographic dynamics of humans and our human ancestors. And so there's geologic evidence, there's fossils, there's archaeology and anthropological evidence, there's genetic evidence, and there's also stuff we can reconstruct from proxies. Some of this we've talked about, some of it's new. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can pause the video and read through some of it if you would like to. Some of it's pretty interesting, but it's just, for time, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but some of it, we've already talked about the geologic history, and we've talked about proxies and reconstructing past climates and things like that. But some of the anthropological stuff, I'm not going to get into too much, but I do have a reading for you that will talk about some of that stuff. One interesting thing about humans is that we communicate through languages, and language is this really interesting aspect of human culture that I think probably doesn't get enough attention, and it actually can behave or exhibit some similar patterns as species. And so that might sound weird at first, but languages can evolve over time. They can change over time. We can evolve new languages. Past languages can go extinct. Excuse me. And so I think they actually, and you can look at the diversity of languages in similar ways that you can look at the biodiversity of species. And so there's actually a lot of really interesting analogs and parallels between how species behave and how human languages behave. And we can create these maps and look at regional diversity to map the distinctiveness of human civilizations and reconstruct their expansions and look at the similarities at the regional scale between different areas and things like that. And I'm going to come back to this idea a little bit later, but I just wanted to introduce sort of the thinking of languages as or treating them and analyzing them in similar ways as we do species, because there's a lot of overlap there, or at least there's a lot of parallels there. Humans, another thing we do is we move around and we move stuff around with us. So we tend to take other species from, where we're going to, or from where we're from to where we're going. And so humans have actually inflated the biodiversity of island communities by introducing species, which has actually changed the species area and species isolation relationships. So here you're seeing some data from islands, quite a few islands. I forget what specifically these islands are, but this study found that looking at the extant native species, just the species that are there natively, not the ones that we've introduced, you get this really strong relationship. But if you include the introduced species, then there's not a separate line here, but you can sort of see if we were to draw a separate line, it would be above this line, and it wouldn't have, the trend line would not be as distinct. It would probably be less of a relationship. So basically we've altered those relationships by introducing more species to these areas than what would normally be there. And thus we've changed, since, if you look at the fossils and reconstruct things before humans arrive and then do it after humans arrived, we've changed those species area and species isolation relationships. And I don't think that's news, or this is probably not news to anyone, that we've reduced a lot of the biodiversity globally since, humans have expanded. So if you look at sort of diversity, I think here we're looking at patterns in diversity of terrestrial mammals based on the current assemblages or current communities, and those during periods of similar climatic conditions during the late Quaternary. So this is basically looking back in time before humans showed up. So here is going to be current. This is where we're at currently. This is megafauna on the top here and terrestrial mammals. So this is current diversity, and then this is going back in time over here. And if if we just separate out the megafauna, which again is just like the large bodied mammals, you can see that if back in time, there was lots and lots of diversity. I don't know exactly what indice they're using here, but probably like species richness or something. You can see that especially in North America and parts in Europe, there were much higher, much higher levels of biodiversity. And we've talked about this, back the fact that megafauna were disproportionately influenced during the Pleistocene. All those extinction events were much more heavily concentrated in organisms that were much larger. But the trend still holds if we look at all mammals. During the Quaternary here, back in time, compared to now, we see pretty drastic reductions in biodiversity globally. So that's, and that's not new. I think, everyone realizes that if you've paid attention to the news anytime in the past like 2 decades or 3 decades, it's been pretty prominent that humans are having this destructive effect pretty much everywhere we go. But that destructive effect, I'm going to come back to this idea that we alter these relationships that are pretty fundamental to patterns in geographic patterns of biodiversity. So here we see the frequency of body size of terrestrial mammals across latitude and how it was affected by the anthropogenic extinctions and range reductions. So this is a little bit of a funky chart here, but basically we have body size on our x-axis here and frequency of organisms at that body size on our y-axis. And the different charts here are at different latitudes. So basically you have a different chart at each latitude here. And you have it colored by the purple is going to be the current, what those organisms distribution by body size is currently. And then the red is going to be what it was basically before humans came into contact with those groups. And so basically what you can see is that, for smaller organisms, there's not a whole lot of difference. It's basically perfect overlap, maybe in some areas like here and, a little bit here in these smaller body sizes. Where you see the big difference is the large body sizes here. And that lines up perfectly with what we know, is that megafaunal extinction was really high. Basically, there were disproportionate extinctions for large-bodied organisms. And that has actually influenced another relationship. So another relationship is that, come down here to this chart, and let's just ignore these two lines and look at this red line here. Basically, a fundamental pattern in biogeography is that as the latitude of the geographic range increases on our x-axis, the body size tends to increase. So if you go to a higher latitude, you're likely going to have a larger organism than at a lower latitude. And that's pretty fundamental. However, if you look at just current distributions of species, or sorry, mammals, you actually get a different relationship. You get this decreasing trend where higher latitudes have lower smaller body sizes. And that's really the product of this disproportionate thing going on here, where you can kind of see, especially at higher latitudes, if that's where the large organisms are, and we cause the large organisms to go extinct, then yeah, you're going to definitely fundamentally change this relationship. So now it's decreasing, whereas historically, if humans were not involved, you would have this increasing trend here. So that's been an interesting effect on the anthropogenic expansion of humans over time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So specifically, what have humans been up to for the past few 100,000 years? Here we're seeing the maximum geographic range of Homo erectus, and basically, like, what humans do, what we do is we move around. We don't tend to stay put in one place. I don't know if there's something innate about humans that we just like to expand and push beyond. We're not really content with where we're at. We just like to keep going. And that's been the case for most of the human ancestors. I think Homo erectus was probably one of the not a direct ancestor. We came from a separate line, seems like, but they were one of the most well dispersed, if I remember right. And so here we're seeing their geographic range from about 2.4 up to 4 million years ago, and some potential dispersal routes that would have allowed this species to get out of Africa. because basically Africa is huge, but it's sort of an island, and has been disconnected. But there were a couple of dispersal routes, that are labeled here in yellow. And these numbers, these white numbers, indicate, I think, the age of fossils that have been found. Indicating question marks might indicate some uncertainty about that date. Again, those dates tend to change a lot. That's just something sort of fundamental to this field of science, that there's not a lot of data, and so when you do find a little bit, it can reshuffle things quite a bit. But humans and ancestors of humans have been moving around for a long time. When you look at humans, this is sort of almost a contrast. I mean, humans have moved around so much since we came out of Africa. So, this is list saying 200,000 years ago. That date might be close, might be off by 100,000 years. I'm not really sure. Those things get changed a lot, like I said. But the general consensus is that Homo sapiens, our species, originated in Africa, evolved out of Africa, and migrated, or dispersed out of Africa, probably through some of those same dispersal routes as Homo erectus, and sort of made our way, through Eurasia and down into the Pacific, Eastern Pacific, into Australia, and up over here over time. And it didn't take a ton of time, geologically speaking. Anyway, we were pretty quick to disperse throughout these areas. Something interesting is you'll notice this question mark around when humans entered North America. And a lot of evidence, the prevailing theory has been about 15,000 years ago. However, recently we've been finding some evidence that has been questioning these dates, and I actually have a reading for you that I think is pretty cool. It comes from this book called The End of the Megafauna. I may have mentioned it. It's about the Pleistocene, but it has this whole chapter about how humans were moving around and when we actually came to North America. I'll have you go through that reading here in a bit. But basically, humans move around a lot. We move around a lot of stuff with us, and that has a lot of impacts on the environment. And it's not just that we move stuff around. We use the environment, alter the environment as we go. So that has lots of implications. Something interesting also about this is that during this time, there are interglacial periods of the Pleistocene that we talked about, and during the last glacial maxima, something we talked about is that, as this sea ice expands, or as the ice expands, the sea levels drop, because it's basically sucking moisture out of the water cycle there. And you get this lowering of sea levels, so there's more continental shelf area that's exposed as land, and people can disperse. The thinking was that this allowed people to disperse, especially in this area, a lot more. There was all these dispersal routes that probably opened up and allowed humans to get basically from southeastern Asia all the way to Australia. And here you're seeing some of those potential dispersal routes. But this is interesting because basically, there may have been land routes, but they're also necessary to get all the way here. It would have been necessary to have some sort of seafaring vessel, or the capability of traveling by sea. And so basically the colonization of the Pacific realm by humans required the development of sophisticated sailing vessels many centuries before the height of European exploration. So basically people sort of, this is a bias of probably Western education, that we sort of uphold Western and European expansion as like the first example of humans developing the technology to move beyond where they were, but that definitely wasn't the case. I mean, this is centuries and centuries before Europeans started exploring, that humans were probably already doing this and moving around quite a bit. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this portion of the video. There is a reading, so this is a chapter from that end of the megafauna, which really goes into some cool detail about how humans have moved around, and takes a sort of a deeper dive into when we may have shown up in North America, whether that was 15,000 years ago, or whether that may have been actually much longer before that. So work your way through that reading. and keep working your way through the module, and I will see you in the next video.